We've got lives and I've got children, and the effort that we put in, because we work really hard.
George Harrison, remembered for his calm and contemplative nature, was in fact the very person who made Ringo Starr, the gentle drummer of the Beatles, bitterly admit, "There was a time when I truly disliked George." In a rare conversation with Rolling Stone, Ringo lifted the curtain of time for the first time, revealing the darker corners between him and George that the world had never heard for decades. The affair between George and Maureen, Ringo's wife, right inside their own home, the accumulating fractures during the collapsing years of the Beatles, and the long-running financial tensions with Paul McCartney that stretched years after the band's breakup. What pushed Ringo, the most private member of the Beatles, to break more than 40 years of silence? And behind his gentle exterior toward George Harrison, how many untold stories were still hidden? It wasn't the studio, it wasn't business, and it wasn't an artistic argument. One of the deepest wounds in Ringo Starr's heart began in the most private place, the home he had once tried so hard to protect from the storms of show business. The story took place in the early 1970s, when the marriage between Ringo and Maureen Cox, the woman who had been by his side since the days of hardship, began showing signs of breaking. But no one in the scene expected that the person contributing to the collapse would be George Harrison, a close teammate for over a decade. At that time, George was living at Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames, having just released All Things Must Pass and becoming a symbol of spiritual artistry through Hindu philosophy, meditation, and compassion. Yet beneath that serene exterior was a chain of personal crises he kept hidden. George's marriage with Pattie Boyd had also deteriorated. After repeated arguments and many nights George disappeared without explanation, Pattie felt suffocated. In her memoir, Wonderful Tonight, she recalled a shocking detail. Maureen, Ringo's wife, often visited George's home even when Pattie was away. At first, Pattie assumed it was small talk between friends, but gradually the closeness between Maureen and George became so evident that it could no longer be explained as friendship. Once, Maureen stayed overnight, saying she was avoiding photographers outside the gate. George offered no explanation. Pattie didn't ask. But after that night, she began sleeping in a separate room. In late 1973, Ringo returned from Los Angeles after finishing his solo project Ringo, and was warned by close friend Klaus Voormann that something wasn't right between George and Maureen. According to You Never Give Me Your Money by Peter Doggett, Ringo went straight to Abbey Road Studios where George was recording and confronted him. There was no concrete evidence, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only a heavy look of disappointment and Ringo's cold, piercing sentence, "I know everything." Silence filled the room. A technician present told BBC Radio 2 that after a few minutes standing still, George said a sentence that froze the entire studio. "I care about her." No one dared continue. Ringo left without a word for weeks after he cut all contact with George. Maureen remained silent in front of the press. George refused all questions, issuing only a brief two-line statement through Apple Records. "We do not comment on private matters." Although no official legal dispute was made public, court documents from the London High Court indicate that Ringo filed for divorce in July 1975, citing irreconcilable hurt. The identity of the third party was not stated. Yet within the artistic community, it was quietly understood. The hidden name was George. After that, Maureen almost disappeared from public life. She lived quietly in Sussex, rarely appearing before reporters, avoiding interviews, and cutting ties with the remaining Beatles members. Hounded by the media for more than a year, she fell into emotional distress and underwent treatment at a private clinic in Wiltshire, according to the Beatles, off the record. As for George, months after the incident, he publicly began a relationship with Olivia Arias, an administrative staff member at Dark Horse Records. They soon married and had a child. George never mentioned Maureen again in any interview, even after her passing in 1994 due to illness. For more than 2 decades after the event, Ringo avoided collaborating with George in any form. Any invitation from George was politely but firmly declined. In Apple Corps meetings, Ringo spoke only through intermediaries or his assistant. No one in the industry ever saw them sit together again the way they had during the Hamburg tours or the Ed Sullivan Show tapings. From a friendship that once meant sharing blankets backstage and drinking together in dressing rooms, Ringo now saw George only as someone he once knew. Years later, in a letter to director Michael Lindsay Hogg, Ringo wrote a single sentence believed to refer to George: "There are people who leave you not by walking away, but by actions they never apologize for." And that was only the first fracture, because just 1 year before that dramatic event, George Harrison had already been caught in another controversy, this time not about relationships, but splashed across front pages when he was detained in a raid that plunged the Beatles into chaos. On the morning of March 12, 1969, in the thin mist covering Henley-on-Thames, vehicles from the Metropolitan Police quietly entered the front gate of Friar Park, the home of George Harrison and his wife, Pattie Boyd. It was 6 a.m., and George had no idea he was about to face one of the biggest shocks of his career. The search warrant was signed by Inspector Norman Pilcher, known across the UK for sweeping operations involving artists. He had detained Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, and Donovan in the 2 years prior. Pilcher was the name that made every band in the 60s and 70s uneasy, as he often appeared without warning. According to the Times, officers found a small amount of controlled items stored in a lacquered wooden box near George's audio equipment in the living room. George and Pattie were separated for questioning. The inspection lasted nearly 3 hours before lawyers were called. The police's initial statement only said, "A well-known musician is under investigation for possession of a controlled item." But the press needed nothing more. Within 12 hours, George Harrison's name was on the front page of newspapers from Daily Mail and New York Post to the Sydney Morning Herald. Once considered the most disciplined Beatle, George's image began to shake. Before this, he was known for meditation, for living in ashrams in India, quoting the Bhagavad Gita, speaking of transcending ego and detaching from material. He once said music is a path toward awakening. But behind that spiritual image were truths long whispered about in the scene. According to George Harrison, Behind the Locked Door by Graham Thompson, George often hosted late-night gatherings at Friar Park. Guests included artists, directors, designers, and people whose identities weren't always clear. Strong drinks, ambient music, dim red lights, a hazy atmosphere, all of it formed a world completely different from the pure spiritual image he presented to the public. Some informal sources even claimed that John Lennon attended several of these gatherings, especially in 1968, when he and Yoko Ono began exploring expanded awareness through certain experimental experiences. The Evening Standard once published a piece by Ray Connolly hinting at a London circle of artists whose boundaries between art, intimacy, spirituality, and influence were blurred. No names were stated, but the description matched the environment of Friar Park. Although no official allegations were made about personal conduct, George's public image after the detainment remained clouded in doubt throughout the 1970s. He still meditated, still wore prayer beads, still organized concert for Bangladesh, but the public no longer viewed him as the light of the Beatles. The most shocked member was not Paul or John, it was Ringo. He knew George wasn't a monk, but he never imagined that the person who preached enlightenment could be detained right inside the home he used for meditation. In his 1983 interview with Timothy White of Rolling Stone, Ringo said, "I wasn't surprised. "I was disappointed." It was disappointment not only toward George, but toward the trust he had once placed in a longtime friend. The incident seriously affected the Beatles' activities. EMI and Capitol Records held an emergency meeting and paused media campaigns. Their next album release was delayed by 3 weeks. John did not attend meetings. Paul stayed quiet. Ringo, for the first time, requested not to sit next to George during joint interviews. Their relationship began to fracture. No arguments, no open conflict, just a cold distance, quietly understood, affecting both their personal and professional lives. After the detainment, the press did not let go. Articles resurfaced about George's mysterious absences during the 1966 U.S. tour. Stories of his appearances at Chelsea gatherings with unknown companions, and leaked notes suggesting George had joined a private meditation group with several controversial figures in the contemporary art world. No one could confirm anything, but everyone understood. George Harrison was no longer the quiet Beatle. For Ringo, the detainment was not just a scandal, it was a moment of revelation, the moment he realized George was not the person he had believed him to be. The image of a companion who once shared conviction and stood with him on the Shea Stadium stage in 1965 now remained only as a tangled, regretful memory. While the press was still busy writing about that scandal, another upheaval quietly exploded, this time not about private life, but a battle signed, backed by lawyers, and with threats of legal action between two people who once stood shoulder to shoulder on Liverpool's stage. In August 1976, at a moment when the post-Beatles atmosphere seemed to be calming, an unexpected blow struck from a place no one suspected. A love song that seemed to symbolize reconciliation instead became the spark for an unprecedented legal confrontation between two core members of the legendary band. The song, called "I'll Still Love You," written by George Harrison in the early 1970s, had been seen as a meditative ballad, melancholic and introspective, colored by the Hindu spiritual influence George pursued in the years after the Beatles split. He wrote it while living quietly at Friar Park, searching for insight amid personal ruptures. At first, George planned to include the song on the album Somewhere in England, but later abandoned it for unclear reasons. Years passed with no one mentioning it until Ringo Starr, while recording his 6th solo album Ringo's Rotogravure at Sunset Sound Studios, Los Angeles, unexpectedly contacted George to ask permission to record the song. George agreed. Some saw it as a goodwill gesture after a stretch of misunderstandings from the early 70s, especially the explosive episode involving Maureen Cox, Ringo's ex-wife. However, reconciliation proved only an illusion. When Ringo's new arrangement was finished, the problem erupted immediately. Producer Arif Mardin, who had worked with Aretha Franklin, the Bee Gees, and many other big names, recalled that George became so angry he lost control when he heard Ringo's version. Instead of a quiet, meditative space, Ringo's arrangement leaned toward pop disco, using electronic keyboards, a punchy bass, and dense harmonies that made George feel as if a spiritual piece had been dragged onto the dance floor. Just days after Ringo completed the recording, George's legal office in London sent an official letter to Ringo's management company. The message was direct: either remove the song from the album or revise the entire arrangement to match the original demo exactly. If not, George was prepared to take legal action. The story leaked at once. Melody Maker ran a big headline: George Harrison takes action against Ringo Starr. Beatles friendship becomes a court summons. Meanwhile, New Musical Express ran a sarcastic editorial: love remains, but the lawyers have stepped in. The press seized the chance. Articles dug up a string of signs of tension between the two, from the 1974 affair to refusals to appear together, even to the episode where George reportedly declined to invite Ringo to the concert for Bangladesh while inviting Bob Dylan and Eric Clapton. Ringo, usually private, gave no interviews for 3 weeks. But according to drummer Jim Keltner, who had worked alongside him on many tours, Ringo almost smashed the tape machine when he read George's letter. He threw the original demo onto the floor and exclaimed, "That's enough. First my wife. Now even a song must come with conditions?" Although no formal legal case ever went to court, the consequences were worse than a trial. George refused to meet Ringo for more than 2 years. All collaboration invitations were declined without explanation. When George launched the album 33 1/3 at the Savoy Hotel, London at the end of 1976, he avoided all questions about Ringo, leaving only a cold remark. "I'm not happy, that's all." "I'll Still Love You" ultimately did appear on Ringo's rotogravure in September that year, but George Harrison's name was absent from the arrangement credits. This sparked speculation that George had asked to have his name withdrawn so as not to be associated with a version he could not accept. The irony was brutal. "I'll Still Love You," a song written about forgiveness and unconditional love, became a symbol of an irreparable break in a friendship that had lasted more than a decade. There was no reconciliation, no hug, no meeting to clear the air. For George, it may have been a matter of musical principle, but for Ringo, it was a final blow to an already rotten trust. He had believed that even with distance, they were 4 brothers who'd stood together through the golden years. Yet when an old friend didn't call, didn't speak plainly, but instead brandished legal letters, Ringo understood the relationship could not be saved. But that humiliation was only the surface. Deep down, Ringo carried another wound. For nearly 2 decades, he had felt like an extra in the very group that had lifted him to the top. In almost every historic Beatles photo, if you look closely, Ringo Starr is often positioned at the edge of the frame, rarely in the center, rarely the focal point. That wasn't just a photographer's arrangement, it symbolized his actual place within the group for nearly a decade. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, the trio who'd known each other since adolescence, who'd gone to the same schools, played in Liverpool bands like the Quarrymen, and stood together during the instant noodle days in Hamburg, shared memories no one else could understand. They had inside jokes, shorthand glances that said everything on stage. Ringo, who joined in August 1962 after the Beatles had signed with Parlophone and begun to draw press attention, was the late arrival, a technical addition, not an emotional one. According to music historian Mark Lewison in Tune In, Paul was initially reluctant to replace original drummer Pete Best. He worried Ringo, known mainly from cavern jam sessions, might disrupt the chemistry of the 3 who had been together from the start. But in the end, because of his steady drumming, they brought him in. A purely tactical decision, nothing more. As a result, Ringo never truly entered the Beatles' inner circle. In Abbey Road Studios, particularly from Rubber Soul to Sgt. Pepper's, Ringo was often called in after vocals, bass, and guitars were already done. Sometimes he was present only a few hours a week. Producer George Martin once half-joked, "He's a good drummer, but not needed on every track." A comment that seemed harmless, but, repeated, planted a sense of being undervalued in Ringo's heart. Tensions rose further as the group entered the turbulent late 60s. At the Warwick Hotel, New York, in 1965, during the big U.S. tour, John, Paul, and George often gathered in a private room. Ringo, though a band member, was given a room 3 floors away. He wasn't invited to the late-night sing-alongs after shows. A hotel staffer recalled, "Ringo often quietly went to bed early while the others partied until dawn." This was not an isolated case. While recording the White Album, Ringo once suggested trying a Latin feel on Savoy Truffle, but George Harrison ignored him completely. No response, no nod. George stood, walked out of the studio without explanation. A small action, but to Ringo it was a sign of deliberate disregard. Engineer Ken Scott remembered, "No one said Ringo was bad. but they always acted as if he were superfluous, not worth real artistic discussion. The isolation extended beyond music and into major decisions. In 1969, when John proposed hiring Alan Klein as the new manager to replace Brian Epstein, a crucial meeting included only 3 people: John, Paul, George. Ringo wasn't informed beforehand. He learned about decisions only after they were final. Similarly, in talks about restructuring Apple Corps, Ringo was usually the last to receive reports. He later told BBC Radio 2, "I'm a member of the Beatles, but at times I felt more like a guest." In the media, he was labeled the least visible Beatle. Internally, he was seen as compliant, so there's no need to ask him. And the truth was, no one wanted to listen to him. George Harrison's coolness in the later years cut deeply into Ringo. George had once invited him to dinner, shared spiritual teachings, given him his first Bhagavad Gita. But when tensions erupted, George became the one who pushed Ringo away the most. At the peak, during a private Apple board meeting in 1970, Ringo discovered George had signed a separate clause dividing profits from reissue royalties without informing him. Documents cited by journalist Philip Norman in the biography Shout revealed a discrepancy of over £90,000, a large sum amid Britain's economic woes and inflation at the time. This was no longer about music. It was deliberate exclusion. An old friend now cutting your share without notice. Teammates meeting without inviting you. A legendary band split like corporate shareholders. I was always the late arrival, but they made me feel like I didn't belong. The pain of being shut out from the thing that once lifted him to the top, that was the deepest wound. But that distance would stretch further. When money was divided, Ringo discovered that George had withheld more than he had promised. For those who know the Beatles only through classics like Hey Jude or While My Guitar Gently Weeps, it's hard to imagine that behind each melody was a string of recording nights layered with anger, hurt, and an oppressive silence. For Ringo Starr, the late 1960s were no longer musical joy, but a long period of cold isolation, and the focal point of that isolation was George Harrison. Everything began in the summer of 1968, when the band entered one of their most ambitious and conflicted projects, the album The Beatles, also known as The White Album. From May to October, EMI Studios at Abbey Road became an underground battleground where each member carried a growing ego, an atmosphere of mutual unwillingness, and old wounds that were rubbed raw again. John Lennon brought Yoko Ono to every session, a move seen as a break with Beatles tradition. Paul McCartney fell into obsessive control, demanding dozens of takes over a missed beat or a wrong note. George Harrison, newly returned from India with a sitar collection and meditative experiences, was no longer the quiet youngest. He began to show irritation, especially toward Ringo's contributions. Engineer Jeff Emmerich wrote in Here, There, and Everywhere that George increasingly dominated musical decisions, even ignoring or openly rejecting any suggestion from Ringo. In a session for Savoy Truffle, when Ringo proposed a samba beat to liven the track, George gave no response. He simply signaled to the engineer to mute Ringo's microphone. Everything crossed the line one afternoon in August 1968 while they were recording back in the USSR. After hours of criticism from Paul and George about his drumming being boring, too simple, Ringo suddenly stood up, put down his sticks, took off his headphones, and walked out of the studio without a word. The band and production team were stunned. No one knew where he had gone. 2 weeks later, Ringo had almost vanished from the UK radar. Only years later did people learn he had flown to Sardinia, Italy, staying on the yacht of actor Peter Sellers, who'd worked with him on The Magic Christian. Ringo described the time as an emergency escape from London, from the Beatles, from everything getting toxic. He sat and wrote in his diary. The first line read, "I am a member of the Beatles, but no one acts like that matters." While Ringo disappeared, Paul McCartney himself recorded the drum parts for Back in the USSR and 2 other songs. A professional decision, but one with a cold message: we can carry on without you. When Ringo returned to the studio 2 weeks later, George didn't bother to turn around. No handshake, no greeting. He even suggested replacing Ringo's newly recorded drum parts with a drum machine Mal Evans had prepared. A humiliating, wordless slight. A man who had been one of the legendary quartet was now treated like a hired session musician. This period was also when the band began filming the documentary for Let It Be, which was supposed to be the final intimate backstage look at the Beatles. But what the cameras captured, much of which was later cut, was Ringo quietly tapping drums in a corner, with no one talking to him. George hardly looked his way, except when he had to give technical direction. In a scene omitted from the official release and later restored in the Beatles anthology, George can be heard complaining, "I can't keep slowing down because someone can't keep up with my ideas." The camera turns to Ringo, sitting dazed and unresponsive. In his private diary, he wrote, "I didn't know who I was in the group anymore. They acted as if I were a stranger." The pain didn't explode. It smoldered like a drum muffled by a cloth, not ringing out, but persistent. Although the album was completed, tours were canceled, and the Beatles held on for a little while longer, the crack in Ringo's heart never healed. That was the first time he left the group, but not the last time he felt excluded from the place he once called family. But the artistic hurt was only the surface, because after Let It Be, when the group officially split, an even colder battle awaited Ringo at the Apple Corps boardroom, where he would discover that beyond being undervalued, he was also being paid less than he deserved. The fact was that from the early days, even though they performed together and signed recording contracts together, Ringo's share of the profits was always lower than John's, Paul's, and George's. According to EMI tax records, registration code 2035BE-BEA62, the 3 founding members received publishing percentages based on the number of songs they wrote. Ringo, having written fewer songs, was categorized as a supporting musician, paid per song rather than sharing total revenue. Even on the 1965 U.S. tour, when the Beatles took more than $1 million in fees at Shea Stadium, Ringo's share was only about 60% of Paul's, Paul being the primary songwriter and the de facto financial organizer at the time. But out of trust, Ringo did not speak up. However, things began to get unimaginably worse after April 1970, when the Beatles formally announced their breakup. To fans, it was the end of a legend. But inside the group, it was the start of a drama full of lawsuits, betrayals, and irreparable divisions, unfolding right at Apple Corps headquarters at 3 Savile Row, London. Apple began as a beautiful dream. They wanted to create a global creative empire, music, film, fashion, and art developing together, free from major label control. But soon enough, the company became a jar of honey with no lid, money flowing out unchecked, artists signed simply because George liked them or John wanted to experiment. In the first 3 years, Apple dissipated more than $2 million, equivalent to over $30 million today, on lavish decor, endless parties, and a string of failed art projects. No one truly controlled the finances. No one bothered to balance the books. But Ringo believed he was on the same front as George and John, especially when the 3 allied to oppose Paul and bring Alan Klein into management. That trust was quickly betrayed. Beginning in 1972, Ringo started hearing rumors that George had quietly signed contracts to redistribute Beatles songs in the Asian market through Dark Horse Records, George's personal company, without consulting or gaining Apple's consent. And indeed, according to commercial court records in London, case AC 1972 Beatles, George independently signed licensing deals for more than 15 Beatles songs for Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, collecting nearly $140,000 in advance royalties, none of which were shared with Ringo. More strikingly, the contract noted Ringo's stake as 0% not involved. In May 1973, at Apple's shareholders' meeting, Ringo publicly demanded for the first time, "I want to know why nobody told me about this." George replied tersely, "It's a small matter. I handled it quickly to avoid paperwork." The answer sounded casual, but it was enough to plunge their relationship into full-scale freezing. From then on, Ringo hired independent auditors. At the end of 1974, an internal report of more than 80 pages revealed that nearly £410,000 had been redirected internally by George from Apple's Artist Development Fund into personal projects, including building a private studio at Friar Park, funding tours for Ravi Shankar, and expanding a documentary and spiritual film business in India. Ringo also discovered that two protégés he had supported, Lon and Derek Van Eaton, had their contracts terminated without notice because George wanted to clear the way for favored artists. The replacement was none other than Ravi Shankar, the spiritual friend George praised as a guiding light for modern music. The climax came in February 1975, when Ringo was informed that royalties from his solo album Goodnight Vienna had been delayed for over 8 months because accounting prioritized an advance for George's film project The Inner Light. This time, Ringo did not stay silent. He quietly declared he would stop supporting Apple's activities unless there was transparent auditing. He did not take the matter public. No lawsuit. No media exposure. But in a rare BBC Panorama interview in June 1976, when asked which member of the old group disappointed you the most, Ringo merely gave a faint smile and said, "There are people who know how to be a friend, and there are people who know how to calculate money." One sentence that encapsulated nearly 15 years of attachment, all the ups and downs, loyalty, and quiet betrayals hidden among cold figures on paper. It seemed the rift could not be mended. Yet fate arranged one last reunion for them, in circumstances no one expected. During your time with the Beatles, was there ever a member you truly clashed with? Silence fell. Ringo did not answer immediately. He leaned back slightly, eyes toward the window where the sunset painted the London sky gold. The air felt taut with something unsaid. Then, almost without warning, he turned, looked straight at the interviewer, eyes hard with a chill. "I used to hate George, really hate him, for a long time. Not a momentary temper, not a quarrel over songs. This was anger distilled over years, from being belittled in the studio, from the scandal with Maureen Cox, Ringo's ex-wife, to the threatened lawsuit over I'll Still Love You, and a succession of financial murkiness behind Apple Corp. Press reports once claimed they reconciled in 1987 when George invited Ringo to record on Cloud 9. The reality was different. Jeff Lynne, the album's producer, told Q magazine that during 3 days in the studio, they exchanged only 2 sentences. Though they occasionally crossed paths at memorials, honors, or charity events, the handshake between Ringo and George was always cold, the hug awkward, their eyes never truly meeting. In 1997, George discovered he had throat cancer. He kept his illness private for nearly 2 years. When news broke, many close artists already knew: Eric Clapton, Ravi Shankar, even Bob Dylan. But Ringo did not. It was only in the summer of 2001, when George moved to the U.S. for treatment at Staten Island University Hospital, that George's family informed Ringo. At that time, Ringo was in Massachusetts preparing an NBC appearance. His flight was canceled, his interview schedule disrupted. He flew on a private plane alone, carrying an old notebook and a few photos from the 1966 tour. According to the Backstage Beatles podcast, When he arrived at the hospital, Ringo entered a cold white room where George lay among machines and IV drips. No cameras, no reporters. No witnesses to the meeting except a nurse and two relatives. Just a long look between two men who'd once shared hotel rooms, eaten late-night pizza in Paris, and stood behind Shea Stadium as 60,000 people screamed. Ringo asked a few short questions about George's health. George nodded. Occasionally, he gave a weak smile, a limp handshake. Then Ringo left, quiet, alone, as if carrying a block of memory nobody wanted to touch. On 29 November 2001, George Harrison passed away. The memorial at Royal Albert Hall was grand. Paul spoke. Eric Clapton played with Donnie, but Ringo offered no speech. He sat silently in the second row, eyes fixed on the stage, his face covered with a layer of ash. 2 years later, when The Guardian asked about that final visit, Ringo only smiled wryly. "I visited George when he was ill. I did what needed to be done. But I'm not sure I've forgiven him in my heart." It was not forgiveness, nor was it indifference. It was a bitter silence, the silence of someone who once loved, who was hurt, and who knew time could not mend what had been broken. "I used to hate George, really hate him, for a long time." Ringo repeated the line a second time, as a kind of closing, and those unsaid things became memories that would never fully close for the one who remained. Beneath the dazzling stage lights and immortal recordings, there were cracks never healed. Ringo and George, two men who once called each other brothers, quietly passed one another like two lines that would never meet again. Not because they no longer loved music, but because some wounds cannot be repaired by melody. And perhaps the most haunting thing about this story is not the conflict, but that time stole the chance for forgiveness. Do you think Ringo ever truly forgave George? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you want to keep exploring untold corners of music legends, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the latest videos.